Rest in peace, Dr. McDougall, who's died at the, some would say ripe old age, some would say relatively young age of 77 years old. I think that's about the average in the United States. The average in the United States is slightly less than the average globe, well, in other developed countries. So I don't think it's a particularly long life for someone who was espousing health and wellness. But all that aside, rest in peace, doctor. Let's see. I wanted to react to a video that he made recently. This was on his site a couple of weeks ago. Let me just check the exact date. 12 days ago, so June 13th. So he died June 22nd from what I can make out. So yeah, he died June 22nd. This was made on June 13th. So 9 days after he published this, he passed away. Keep that in mind. Let's take a look.
No, this is a point of argument as far as what your plate should look like and how you should portion your various components of your meal out. The way I look at it is you should consume mostly starch. And starch is things.
Mostly starch, of course, is a really bad idea. In fact, some of us don't eat any starch, and I think we're doing well better than he was.
You like beans and corn and rice and potatoes and sweet potatoes.
I should just mention before I don't want to be disrespectful, but I should just mention that he passed away in his sleep, which is usually an indication of some kind of heart attack or stroke, some kind of heart disease, most likely. I can't be sure, obviously, without an autopsy, without knowing more about what's going on. All his family has said is that he died in his sleep. So I'm assuming it's some kind of heart disease because that's mostly what happens.
Bread and pasta, these are starches. That should be the bulk of your meal plan. And because I'm so focused on starch, I realize I named my most popular book, The Starch Solution. And when I proposed that as a title, the publisher thought that was suicide to put the title starch on the front of a book. But
so it's really unfortunate that's a really unfortunate sentence, that his publisher thought that The Starch Solution was suicide. I think he meant suicide in terms of it was not going to sell. But given that he was 10 days away from death, I don't know. It's an unfortunate thing to say.
I said, that's what I'm all about, starch. Well, because of my emphasis on how much starch you should eat, I say 90%. Why do I say 90%? Well, because that's what traditional populations of people would consume, is they were lucky.
So I think, listen, this is not the first video I've seen of this guy. I'm familiar with their arguments. Most of their data on 90% starch or whatever is coming from Okinawa, an Okinawa data set that was collected in the 1940s and 50s, while Okinawa was basically under starvation conditions. They had no choice but to have 90% of their diet be potatoes and sweet potatoes because that's all they were being given because there was a war on, or the war had just finished. And they were the most poor region of Japan. They weren't actually, they were formerly part of Japan, but they weren't historically part of Japan. So studying that population gives us a good lesson in what starvation food looks like. It doesn't give us a good lesson in anything else.
If they got enough food, first of all, among the Mayans and the Aztecs, among the people of ancient times, they're lucky if they got enough food, and they were just happy to get enough starch. But anyway, I know.
So the Mayans and the Aztecs, I mean, not sure what particular data set he's looking at. First of all, we can't know what they ate, right? This is before there was writing, but the Spanish destroyed most of their records when they took over those places, okay? So we don't know what they were eating. And also, some of those societies were highly dependent on slave labor. And we know that in order for slave labor to work, you need to feed the slaves something very, very cheap. And yes, starch fits the bill. So it doesn't make sense to be advocating something based on the fact that this was something that was used in a society that was heavily dependent on the labor of people who had been enslaved.
For example, based upon good dietary histories, that before 1980, over 90% of the food in China came from rice. So
again, like you're talking about a period of time when China had really suffered. It had suffered from World War II. There were problems to do with the Cultural Revolution, and so on. So you're talking about a population that was extremely impoverished. And yes, in the context of a population that's extremely impoverished, a rice-based diet is enough to survive. Is it enough to thrive? Is it enough to optimize health? I would say absolutely not. And now when we look at the other populations, so China, Hong Kong especially, which is very long-lived, they eat the most meat per capita of any place on earth.
I always tell people 90%. But in practicality, as people around me, and particularly my wife Mary, say, is that when she looks at my plate, it doesn't look like 90% starch. It looks like I have a lot more green and yellow vegetables. Well, based upon the calories consumed, I bet it's 90%. But based on the size of the portions on the plate, it probably comes out to 50% or 70% or whatever. All I want you to do is I want you to get in enough starch. It's inexpensive. You like it.
So again, this guy was giving health advice 10, 12 days before he died in his bed of an apparent heart attack. And the health advice was eat as much sugar. Remember, what is starch? Starch is just, these are simple carbohydrates. These are just sugars, right? They break up in the body exactly like any other sugar. So he's telling you to have as much sugar as possible. Doesn't sound like great dietary advice.
Gives you the energy you need, gives you plenty of calories, gives you lots of nutrients to do everything you want, win a race, have a baby, etc.
So here's a question for you. What is the precise dietary requirement of carbohydrate in the diet, right? It's 0. You don't need carbohydrates at all in order to survive.
Starch is key. And it's particularly important
in order not just to survive, in order to thrive. And there would have been societies that he's not mentioning, for example, the Inuit societies, who didn't have access to starch for maybe 10, 11 months out of the year. And when they got access to starch, it was a rare thing, right? And in the form of like dried fruits and stuff like that. So it's, there's a lot he's not saying here. In his assumption that a starch-based diet is appropriate for humans rests on a lot of really weak evidence.
in these days when there have been such an anti-starch movement. They're called low-carb diets. Low-carb diets are very popular because you lose weight and people are familiar with eating meat. So it's not so much of a transition for them at all. And plus, they've been so indoctrinated with the idea that...
So let me just say that as someone who's been vegan and someone who's now close to carnivore, certainly very low carb, it's not that one is more societally acceptable than the other. They're both not particularly easy ways to eat if you're living in sort of mainstream culture. The vegans, doctors all had, rest in peace, McDougall, he had this assumption that somehow people love to eat meat and, that's really part of the culture, et cetera, et cetera. For the last 20, 30 years, that really hasn't been the case. What are the foods that are sort of seen as like culturally appropriate foods in most of the sort of Western societies? Rice and curry, rice and stir fry, pasta and some sauce. Now, these things may have meat in them, but they're not meat-based foods. They're actually starch-based foods. And I think that's one of the things that's led to problems. Now, he didn't have many of the problems. He obviously had problems that I didn't know about because he died. He didn't have many of those problems because his fat intake was so low that he really wasn't activating the Randall cycle and all these other things. He wasn't, he survived pretty much as well as you can on a nutrient deficient diet because he wasn't taking, the combination of fats and carbs is really what's going to be the issue for most people. And he wasn't having that combination at all.
Starches make you fat. They've become unreasonably popular, dangerously popular, these low-carb diets.
Dangerously popular, again, is an unfortunate thing to be saying 12 days before you passed away. Yeah, it's so maybe your diet was dangerously popular, yeah?
So probably some of that emphasis that I put is in opposition to a low-carb diet. I want you to eat enough starch. In practicality, look at your plate, maybe 50, 70, 80, 90% of the food you'll see on your plate comes from the starch category. But we got to make a radical change in your diet. In addition to what I would tell you about changing the proportions of food, change the quantity. You can't eat the same size portions of food you used to eat. You got to eat more.
So again, I knew he was going to say more. When he said you can't eat the same portions, most people would have been thinking that you're going to reduce, but he's saying you got to eat more. Why? Because if you don't eat fats, you need to trick your body. The body's used to processing fats and proteins. If you don't eat fats and proteins, you're going to have to eat a lot more just to sort of trick your body into thinking that it's full. And by the way, your body still doesn't have, look at his body. Your body still doesn't have what it needs in order to put on the muscle and the fat and the bone and all the other stuff. By the way, there's another story that he used to tell. I don't think he told it often, but he fainted in the bathroom and he broke several bones. Maybe I'll find a screenshot and put it on the screen now. But, this guy's never really been that healthy and he's always been frail.
Yeah, you have to eat more. Our food is so low in calories. You know, it has like, half, sometimes a third as many calories as what you were eating. So unless you eat enough food, you're not going to be satisfied. So take the brakes off, take the limits off that appetite of yours and let it go to town. Really enjoy the food, enjoy the starch. Just make sure it's starch. And
It's funny because what he's saying in some ways mimics what I tell people during the transition phase, especially when you take the starch out of your diet, when you take the grains out of your diet, you might feel a bit hungrier than usual in the short term, and that's okay. You can overeat, but in the short term, in a week or 2 weeks, your body should adjust, and you should be eating what I would call sort of appropriate amounts, right? But of course, if you're just eating a diet of carbohydrates, which is deficient in any number of nutrients, you're always going to be hungry. So that's probably what his clients were experiencing.
not mixed up with oil in the form of French fries and potato chips and butter on your potatoes. It's got to be the basic starches.
Very sad. What to say other than this is all very sad. Yeah, look, I mean, my sympathy is limited for these people. Why is my sympathy limited for these people? Because they were speaking with such confidence about what you should be doing. Much more confidence than, for example, how I speak. I mean, I have my views and my clients get a lot better, but I'm very aware that we don't understand the human animal that well. We don't understand human nutrition that well. So I try to be very careful about how I word things. And even in some of the interviews I do with people who more or less agree with me, I'm very careful about how we talk about things. These guys were just full of arrogance, citing data from Okinawa in the 1950s as if that's the be-all and end-all of nutrition. By the way, it wasn't particularly good. It wasn't like a randomized controlled diet. It was just, these guys seem to be living pretty long and they seem to be eating a lot of sweet potatoes. So that means we should all be eating a lot of starch. It was a ridiculous argument to begin with. And it's very, very dangerous. And it plays into certain Christian senses of morality, as I've written about elsewhere. So what I would say is leave the vegan morality aside because it's not morals. The vegan diets are not moral diets. Leave the Christian morality aside. You don't have to deprive yourself. Eat human appropriate foods, which are not starches. Starches are starvation foods. If you have no choice, if you're starving, then yeah, grain is better than anything else if the other thing is just going hungry, right? But if you have the choice of real human food, which is animal fats and proteins, then focus on that. So with that, rest in peace, Dr. McDougall. Thanks. I'm Samir. I'm a PhD student and a health coach. I'll see you in the next one.